Got it.
Welcome to Masterclass Theology. I am Big Rev,
And I'm Pancho.
and it's been a minute, Pancho. I'm so glad to have you back. We took a pause for in our series in First Kings, and I did that end time series, and I hope you've enjoyed. Those of you listening on the podcast, some of you have been enjoying them. I started uploading them to our YouTube channel as well, and so glad to have you here. And so, Pancho, today we're going to continue in First Kings, correct?
We're back.
All right, we're
It's been a
back.
while.
So
Glad to be back. Yeah.
one of the blessings of this series with Pancho is Pancho brings just a fresh perspective, and he brings brand new eyes that hasn't grown up with this. So we're kind of looking at Solomon and looking at like a character study. And so I'm going to just shortly share the screen. Today we're going to be in chapter 6 and 7. So if you pardon me for 1 second, let me share the Bible screen. And okay, let me bring this up a little bit. All right. So First Kings chapter 6. In the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the fourth year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the second month, he began to build the house of the Lord. The house that King Solomon built for the Lord was 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. The vestibule in front of the nave of the house was 20 cubits long, equal to the width of the house, and 10 cubits deep in front of the house. And he made for the house windows with recessed frames. He also built a structure against the wall of the house, running around the wall of the house, both the nave and the inner sanctuary. I got to tell you, Pancho, if there are any general contractors listening to this or anybody who's done any remodeling, they're probably going, wow, look at this. I know exactly what he's talking about. Well, I don't. And so I have to look at a picture. But all right. And he made side chambers all around. The lowest story was 5 cubits broad, the middle one was 6 cubits broad, and the third was 7 cubits broad. For around the outside of the house, he made offsets on the wall in order that the supporting beam should not be inserted into the walls of the house. When the house was built, it was with stone prepared at the quarry, so that neither hammer nor axe nor any tool of iron was heard in the house while it was being built. The entrance to the lowest story was on the south side of the house, and one went up by stairs to the middle story, and from the middle story to the third. So he built the house and finished it. And he made the ceiling of the house of beams and planks of cedar. He built the structure against the whole house, 5 cubits high, and it was joined to the house with timbers of cedar. Now the word of the Lord came to Solomon concerning this house you are building. If you walk in my statutes and obey my rules and keep all my commandments and walk in them, then I will establish my word with you, which I spoke to David your father. And I will dwell among the children of Israel and will not forsake my people Israel. So Solomon built the house and finished it. He lined the walls of the house on the inside with boards of cedar. From the floor of the house to the walls of the ceiling, he covered them on the inside with wood, and he covered the floors of the house with boards of cypress. He built 20 cubits of the rear of the house with boards of cedar. From the floor to the walls, he built this within as an inner sanctuary, as the most holy place. The house, that is, the nave in front of the inner sanctuary, was 40 cubits long. The cedar within the house was carved in the form of gourds and open flowers. All was cedar, no stone was seen. The inner sanctuary was prepared in, excuse me, the inner sanctuary was prepared in the innermost part of the house to set there the ark of the covenant of the Lord. The inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, 20 cubits high, and he overlaid it with pure gold. He also overlaid an altar of cedar, and Solomon overlaid the inside of the house of pure gold. And he drew chains of gold across in front of the inner sanctuary and overlaid it with gold. And he overlaid the whole house with gold until all the house was finished. And the whole altar that belonged to the inner sanctuary was overlaid with gold. In the inner sanctuary, he made 2 cherubim of olive wood, each 10 cubits high. 5 cubits was the length of one wing of the cherub, and 5 cubits the length of the other wing of the cherub. It was 10 cubits from the tip of one wing to the tip of the other. The other cherub was measured 10 cubits. Both cherubim had same measure in the same form. The height of one cherub was 10 cubits, and so that was the other's cherub. He put the cherubim in the innermost part of the house, and the wings of the cherubim were spread out so that the wing of one touched the one wall, and the wing of the other cherub touched the other wall. The other wings touched each other in the middle of the house, and he overlaid the cherubim with gold. All around the walls of the house he carved engraved figures of cherubim and palm trees and open flowers in the inner and outer rooms. The floor of the house he overlaid with gold in the inner and outer rooms. For the entrance to the inner sanctuary he made doors of olive wood The lintel and the doorpost were five-sided. He covered the two doors of olive wood with carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. He overlaid them with gold and spread gold on the cherubim on the palm trees. He also made for the entrance to the nave doorposts of olive wood in the form of a square and two doors of cypress wood. The two leaves of the one door were folding, and the two leaves of the other door were folding. On them he carved cherubim and palm trees and open flowers, and he overlaid them with gold, evenly applied on the carved work. He built the inner court with 3 courses of cut stone and 1 course of cedar beams. In the 4th year, the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid in the month of Ziv, and in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished in all of its parts, and according to all its specifications, he was 7 years building it. Well, my goodness. Pancho, I would imagine the majority of brand new Christians would not waste any time at all with this chapter. They would start reading it and go, okay, got it. Now let's move on. But what does this chapter do to you? It's like, what's going on in your mind as I read that, as you looked at this, 1 Kings chapter 6?
So I guess my first, yeah, lots of interior designing and all kinds of things. My first thought was, and I don't think it was covered in one of these chapters, the plans for this. Did Solomon just make this up? Did David make the plans? Was it because it's very precise, obviously. So they had a big ideas of what they were doing. Was this because I know David wanted to build a temple, Solomon got to build a temple. Um, did they already have the blueprint thing around, or did Solomon just get inspired to do this?
Well, what we do know is that God blessed Solomon with all kinds of ability, and Solomon most likely had a team of guys that were able to most likely the text says Solomon did it. It's possible that Solomon did do it. It's also possible that Solomon has got credit for it. And even if he had something passed down from his father David, he's the one that still has to put finishing touches on it. And so because the Lord was very clear with David, you're not going to build my house. So it comes down to, I don't know if this is divine inspiration. Here's how you're supposed to build it. In the tabernacle, God told Moses, "This is what I want." And so this seems to be a little bit different. But yeah, it's a good question.
And like the like measurements and stuff. I haven't looked back and compared it with the tabernacle, but some of it seems like it might be kind of inspired by that kind of
Mm.
uh, design. Maybe not dimensions exactly, because I think they had a bigger courtyard and stuff, but it was kind of similar layout, at least the idea of it. Um, Starting from the beginning, just things that I jotted down or whatever. Uh, is there any significance to it being 480 years after they were freed from Egypt? Or is that just a good marker and just to let us know how long it had been that the people didn't have a temple?
Good question. Is if there is a significance to that number, but I like that he gave us the number because that reminds us that this is something that happened, and it's put in context in terms of Israel's history. And so, but yeah, it's possible one of God's numbers is 12, and so 48 is 12 times 4, and then one of God's numbers is 10. I mean, you could see some symbolism in there, 12 times 12, 12 times 4 times 10. Okay, there's something going on there. Maybe if you're the kind of person that really takes symbolism from numbers and runs with it, okay, but it could just be something very historical and kind of like what we appreciate with the Gospel of Luke. Luke seems to have done his homework regarding situations going on, like in the Christmas story, Quirinius was governor of Syria, et cetera, et cetera. So we appreciate that because that puts it in historical context. This puts it in historical context, if nothing else. Is there more symbolism? Someone much smarter than me can think about that.
Yeah, for sure. I kind of lean that way too. I haven't gotten into the whole rabbit hole of numerology and symbols of years and all that, and maybe one day, but just curious if you had any more insight on that. Something I did look into a little bit myself because it's been a while and I was curious was about in verse 7, and I've got the NLT, not the ESV, because I wanted the numbers different, but it talks about there was no sound of hammer, axe, or iron toward the building site. And so they did all like the noisy or heavy machinery work away from the side of the temple. And I guess from what I read, it was one of the study Bibles that that kind of comes from Exodus 20:25, where they're talking about God tells them not to wield tools at the side of the temple because it's profane the altar. So I thought that was kind of cool that they still kind of followed that instruction that they had gotten back when they were building the tabernacle and didn't do any of the heavy construction work on site and had to move everything into place to
Mm.
kind of honor that request. So I thought that was kind of cool. That stuck out to me. When I first read it, I was like, why didn't they just hammer and do all the stuff there? It makes more sense, but I get it now. mm,
It's almost like, can we keep this spot as holy as possible? It's can we the grunt work, the shavings going everywhere, the whatever the spark as metal hits, you know, the stone. I don't know, whatever. Can we keep this as less ordinary as possible? Can this be something where this is going to be the spot where God is said to dwell? So can we make this something extraordinary as much as possible and do the work offsite and bring it here versus messing up everything and I'm just saying it's almost like you would not prepare your dinner in the dining room. You could, but it's like you prepare it in the kitchen, you bring it to the dining room. So there's something special about the dining room table that you're not just chopping all your stuff on it. And I mean that's what it
yeah,
sounds like here.
it's a little reverence. I like that.
Yeah.
I just like that. Um, Something else that I just think about a lot, I guess, every time I see this phrase, 'cause I'm a translation nerd, so I look at different ones, but when they talk about the inner sanctuary and the most holy place, I always get reminded that, like, in there's parts in the New Testament where, like, we're called, like, the temple, we are the temple now
Mm.
of God, but some translators do that, like, the word is like sanctuary. We are like the inner sanctuary. The most holy place is in us now. We, carry the Holy Spirit in us. And I always kind of, every time I see the most holy place or sanctuary, I'm like reminded that that's us now. Christ lives in us, and
Yeah,
uh,
that's a great
it's
thought.
not, it's not, it's not talking about the courtyard. It's not talking about it. It's talking about the most holy place where He dwells is in us. And I always, every time I underline every time I see it. And he got protected with the gold chains a little further down, separation. And the only other thing I highlighted in chapter 6 here was, well, actually, I had one other question too. So, while you were reading it, like, a lot of cherubim and open flowers in the design, and they had the statues of the cherubim and everything. Is that those were on top of the Ark of the Covenant too? Yes, correct.
I believe so. Yes,
Yeah.
it's
So
mhm.
those are just like the angels that kind of protect the closest to the throne, or what? Uh, they're not Cupid or whatever, the cherubim. So what is that a little bit?
Right. If you think of Israel's God Yahweh, our God Yahweh, if you think of him as keeping his word, commandment number 2 is not to have any graven images. And if you think about all the other temples and all the other deities that the surrounding nations worship, many of them, if not all of them, had carved representations of that god or goddess in the temple. And Yahweh of Israel said, "No, you're not going to do this of me. You're not going to make." So even in God's official temple, He's not going to have anything that resembles, a carved image of Him. Because how can you put an image on the one that causes existence? It's like because the moment you carve something of God and say this is God, you've now reduced him to that. It's the great sin on the golden calf. It's okay, even if their intentions, you could defend their intentions. We want to worship Yahweh. Okay, so let's make a calf. You've now reduced God to a calf. I mean, so God here, we have cherubim. So I like how you said these angelic or heavenly creatures, whatever you want to call them, things that are in the throne room, the things that are close to God. God allows them to be represented, but God, you're not going to make a carved image of God Himself. And so, even in God's official temple that He is sanctioning, there's not going to be any kind of any kind of a graven or carved image in any way. And so, I like that God stays consistent with that. And so he's allowing the things that are closest to Him. Okay, you can draw cherubim. Okay, that kind of stuff, or you can carve and gold and yeah, because God's place is going to be on the mercy seat on top of the Ark of the Covenant, and so our God is a spiritual God. He's not this physical thing we can carve and then bow down to, like an idol I can take care of, and now all of a sudden that okay, God's going to do something for me. It's like there's
Yeah.
some kind of a distance between sinful humanity and God. And I like how you brought that up earlier with the sanctuary and the idea of the holy place or most holy place is that that temple curtain that separated was torn, and Jesus has gone into that and beyond that. So now we can go to that holy place and we can be that holy place because of Jesus. What used to separate us because Jesus paid it all, now it doesn't separate us. We have separation and unique holiness here. And because of Jesus, that separation for the ones who have been reconciled by his blood on the cross, that separation is not there anymore. And so I like how that stood out to you because we see that in not only the Gospels and the book of Hebrews, but yeah, this idea of he's gone into that holy place. He is that holy place. He's torn that curtain. I mean, yeah. So we're seeing some of the unique separation here that we don't see when Christ is our sacrificial substitute.
Cool, cool. And then just the last thing, 7 years. So this is a 7-year project to build this temple.
It sure is, and he definitely took some time. He definitely it looks like he paid great attention to detail, and he definitely put some effort into this. This wasn't just something happenstance or okay, I'm just gonna slap something together. No, he seems to have taken this seriously. We can respect that. Well, let's go to chapter 7, and so the chapter 6 ends, but it took him 7 years. So right off the bat, chapter 7, Solomon was building his own house 13 years. Oh, so the text puts that like one verse
Yeah,
after. I'm just saying
yeah.
that's just something,
Almost twice as long.
right? So it's almost like the narrator is reminding us, oh, yet Solomon built his own house 13 years and he finished the entire house. He built the house of the forest of Lebanon. Its length was 100 cubits, and its breadth 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. And it was built on 4 rows of cedar pillars with cedar beams on the pillars. And it was covered with cedar from the chambers that were on the 45 pillars, 15 in each row. There were window frames in 3 rows, and window opposite windows in 3 tiers. All the doorways had square frames, and window was opposite window in 3 tiers. My goodness. And he made the hall of pillars. Well, of course he did. Its length was 50 cubits and its breadth 30 cubits. There was a porch in front with pillars and a canopy in front of them. And he made the hall of throne where he was to pronounce judgment, even the hall of judgment. It was finished with cedar from floor to rafters. His own house, and I got to tell you, I've had hamsters and gerbils in the past, and we line the little things. You clean out their cage and line it with cedar. It smells really good. I could imagine this building was awesome. Just saying. His own house, where he was to dwell in the outer court, back of the hall, was of like workmanship. Solomon also made a house like this for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken in marriage. Okay, well that reminds us he's married to Pharaoh's daughter, and he's now built her a similar house, if not the exact same size. Is something the text is saying. Okay, similar. All right. Wow, my goodness. All these were made of costly stones, cut according to measure, sawed with saws back and front, even from the foundation to the coping, and from the outside to the great court. The foundation was of costly stones, huge stones, stones of 8 and 10 cubits, and above were costly stones, cut according to measurement, and cedar. The great court had 3 courses of cut stone all around, and a course of cedar beams. So had the inner court of the house of the Lord and the vestibule of the house. And King Solomon sent and brought Hiram from Tyre. He was the son of a widow of the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a worker in bronze. And he was full of wisdom, understanding, and skill for making and work in bronze. Here Solomon kind of answers our earlier question. Did he do it all? Well, he's bringing in someone that's skilled. He came to King Solomon and did all his work. Oh, okay. He cast 2 pillars of bronze. 18 cubits was the height of one pillar, and a line of 12 cubits measured its circumference. It was hollow, and its thickness was 4 fingers. The second pillar was the same. He also made 2 capitals of cast bronze to set on top of the pillars. The height of the one capital was 5 cubits, and the height of the other was 5 cubits. There were lattices of checker work with wreaths of chain work for the capitals on the tops of the pillars, a lattice for the one capital, and a lattice for the other. Likewise, He made pomegranates in 2 rows around the one lattice work to cover the capital that was on top of the pillar, and he did the same with the other capital. Now the capitals that were on tops of the pillars in the vestibule were of like work, 4 cubits. The capitals were on 2 pillars and also above the rounded projection which was beside the lattice work. There were 200 pomegranates in 2 rows all around, and so with the other capital. He set up the pillars at the vestibule of the temple. He set up the pillar in the south and called its name Yashin, and he set up the pillar on the north and called its name Boaz. How about that? And on tops of the pillars was lily work. It's the only time in history I've ever encountered the word lily work right here. Thus the work of the pillars was finished. Then he made the sea of cast metal. It was round, 10 cubits from brim to brim, 5 cubits high, and a line of 30 cubits measured its circumference. Under its brim were gourds for 10 cubits, encompassing the sea all around. The gourds were in 2 rows, cast with it when it was cast. It stood on 12 oxen, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 south, and 3 east. The area was set on them, the sea was set on them, and their rear parts were inward. Its thickness was a handbreadth, and its brim was made like the brim of a cup, like the flower of a lily. It had 2,000 baths. He also made the 10 stands of bronze. Each stand was 4 cubits long, 4 cubits wide, 3 cubits high. This was the construction of the stands. They had panels, and panels were set in frames, and on the panels that were set frames were lions, oxen, and cherubim. On the frames, both above and below the lions and oxen, there were wreaths of beveled work. Moreover, each stand had 4 bronze wheels and axles of bronze, and as the corners at the 4 corners were supports for a basin. The supports were cast with wreaths at the side of each. Its opening was within a crown that projected upward 1 cubit. Its opening was round as a pedestal is made, a cubit and a half deep. At its opening there were carvings, and its panels were square, not round, and the 4 wheels were underneath the panels. The axles of the wheels were of one piece with the stands, and the height of the wheel was a cubit and a half. The wheels were made like a chariot wheel. Their axles, rims, spokes, and hubs were all cast. There were 4 supports at the corners of each stand. The supports were of one piece with the stands. And on the top of the stand there was a round band a half cubit high, and on the top of the stand its stays and panels were of one piece with it. And on the surface of its stays and on its panels he carved cherubim, lions, and palm trees according to the space of each, with wreaths all around. After this manner he made the 10 stands. All of them were cast alike, of the same measure, of the same form. And he made 10 basins of bronze. Each basin held 40 baths. Each basin measured 4 cubits, and there was a basin for each of the 10 stands. And he set the stands, 5 on the south, 5 on the north, and he set the sea at the southeast corner of the house. Hiram also made the pots, the shovels, the basins. So Hiram finished all the work that he did for King Solomon on the house of the Lord. The 2 pillars, the 2 bowls of the capitals that were on tops of the pillars, and the 2 lattice works that cover the 2 bowls of the capitals were on tops of the pillars. And the 400 pomegranates for the 2 lattice works. Imagine casting in bronze 400 pomegranates. My goodness. 2 rows of pomegranates for each lattice work to cover the 2 bowls of the capitals around the pillars. The 10 stands, the 10 basins on the stands, and the 1 sea and the 12 oxen underneath the sea. Now the pots, the shovels, the basins, and on these vessels of the house of the Lord, which Hiram made for King Solomon, were of burnished bronze. In the plain of the Jordan the king cast them, in the clay around between Sukkot and Zeratan. And Solomon left the vessels unweighed because there were so many of them. The weight of the bronze was not ascertained. So Solomon made all the vessels that were in the house of the Lord, the golden altar, the golden table for the bread of the presence, the lampstands of pure gold, 5 on the south side, 5 on the north, before the inner sanctuary, the flowers, the lamps, the tongs of gold, the cups, snuffers, basins, dishes for incense, and fire pans of pure gold, and the sockets of gold for the door of the innermost part of the house, the most holy place, and the doors of the nave of the temple. Thus, all the work that King Solomon did on the house of the Lord was finished. And Solomon brought in the things that David his father had dedicated, the silver, the gold, the vessels, and stored them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. Oh my goodness. That was something to read. It's chapter 6, now chapter 7. What are your thoughts on so Pancho, it talked about his house. It talked about the attention to detail with the things that are going to go into God's house. And so, any thoughts here? What would someone like you take from a chapter like this, where you're like, man, I don't. I mean, I'm not somebody that's, I did Legos when I was a kid. I mean, I don't understand some of this stuff. I mean, And by the way, there are probably people out there that take this very literally. And if they were going to make a new temple one day, it would be like Solomon's temple, and they would take. I had a great grandfather, the other pastor in my family, my mother's grandfather, and he actually in the Exodus narratives, he read all the measurements and he crafted a tabernacle according to scale. And he was a master woodworker, and I have that tabernacle in my possession. He's like he molded
That's
everything to
cool.
precision and this is a guy who really knew how to craft wood and to fashion stuff. So I could see somebody who would look at all these measurements and someone even listening right now going, yeah, that really makes me feel happy. I'd love to do that. If there's going to be a future temple in Israel, I mean, for those of you who are listening who are like, yeah, I'm looking forward to it, it's probably going to be reading chapter 6 and 7. They want to figure out the dimensions. And so this is important to somebody. And it was important for the writer to give us all these details. But Pancho, what do you do with all this?
Well, so the first thing I will say, sorry, I leaned over. Luckily we're blessed with many translations because I love formal translations too, but I use the NLT for chapters like this because they translate a lot of those numbers into measurements we would know. So to help our craftsmen, like 30 cubits is 150 feet long because I had no idea what a cubit was. So there's certain measurements that study multiple translations. It's good for you, basically, is my first advice for listeners that are also new to the Bible because yeah, sometimes if you're just skimming it and reading all these numbers that you don't know what they mean or what's a cubit and what's I don't know what else they use. But it's good to get some knowledge. The thing we had mentioned a little bit before we started filming was I did think the placement of the part about Solomon's house is kind of interesting. That they're talking about the Lord's house, then they go talk about Solomon's house and describe that, and then they go back to talk about the Lord's house, kind of like a weird juxtaposition or just kind of thrown in there in the middle. And I just wonder about that placement.
Yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
yeah, so it took place as long in the middle. The other thing from that first part that really stood out to me was that it says he even laid out the walls very similar to the courtyard of the Lord's temple. And I feel like that's got to mean something because they wouldn't just throw that in there. Like they could just say, like, throw out the same measurements again, and it was the same exact, one layer of cedar wood between every three layers of stone. But then they also say, just like the temple. And like that's kind of interesting that he chose to use the same design for his house too. Maybe it's kind of common, maybe it's kind of weird, I don't know. But he brought that
That's
over to his
fascinating.
house.
Pancho, that is fascinating. I never picked that up. And I, I'm not going to, I don't want to besmirch Solomon, but what when you just said that, it reminded me of Gideon. And Gideon, and remember the Gideon story from Judges, is that as his life ended, he's like, oh, they wanted to make him king. And he would say things like, well, there's no king but Yahweh. He's the only king. And then Gideon put up a golden ephod in his backyard, and Israel prostituted themselves to that golden ephod. And even though he said only God is king, he named his son Ahimelech, which means my or Avimelech, which means my dad is king. And so it's almost like Solomon's like, oh, God's temple is God's temple, but I'm going to build my house to look like it. I mean,
Kind of similar,
it,
yeah.
it, it could be he just he's God's guy, and he clearly is, and maybe he's wanting to honor God. It's hard to guess too, but I like that you brought that up. That's interesting.
Yeah, that's what I thought too. I was like, why, they put it in there for a reason that he did that. My other, speaking of names, so, and I haven't read this yet, maybe in the future we can do that, but Boaz, I know that name.
Hmm.
Jachin or Jachin, is that another person's name in biblical history, or is that just something he chose?
Mm. Yeah, honestly, I
Something
don't
to check
know.
out, yeah. That's something to think about, though, because I know that Boaz is a person in Jesus'
What
lineage.
verse is it again?
That is 21. Where he names the one tower is named Jachin and the other one is named Boaz. So I just figured I know Boaz is someone's name in history. I didn't know if Jachin was too, or the notes say Jachin means he establishes and Boaz probably means in him is strength. But I think that's just a translation. Like obviously Boaz is someone. It's just what his name means. So I just was wondering if Jachin was a person too.
It's a proper name. I just looked up that name. I just looked it up real quick. It has three occurrences, and one is here, one is in the Chronicle version of this, and then in Second Chronicles 3, and then one is in Nehemiah. It's a name given in Nehemiah 11. So, but yeah, it sounds like a verb. So he establishes. Okay,
Okay, so
sounds
it is a
great.
name, but nothing that
So
sticks a
I
particular.
just looked it up real quick, and I have no other information beyond that.
Okay, okay. Just wanted to, Boaz plays a big role. I wondered if he did too, but cool. So he
Any
didn't pop
Hebrew
out of your
scholars out
head.
there, you go for it. See what you can do.
Yeah, let us know. Um, the other questions I had, and I'm sure other listeners might have too, because they didn't explain too much, is the sea and this giant basin, and he makes 10 other smaller basins. I'm assuming it's for washing or cleaning, or priests tend to be ritually clean, right? Is that what it's for? There's a lot of
You've got
big bowls of water.
yeah. Well, they have to do a lot of washing, and especially of when they sacrifices. I believe the ones that go on that are for God. That when God gives certain pieces, you wash those pieces off. So you wash off whatever innards, or if there's any kind of, I mean, I hate to say the word poop, but whatever's on them as you cut the animal open, it's like, okay, the guts and stuff. It's
And
like
the
you
entrails,
would
yeah,
do
you gotta
that if you were
cut that
eating a
out.
shrimp. You'd peel the shrimp and take off so like there's something about washing and the ritual washing for the priest, etc. Yeah, and it's interesting because there's it's just something that the attention to detail is there, and they call it they call it the sea.
Yeah,
But
it sounds really cool too. Reading like the base with the oxen and facing different directions. And the NLT it says it so the sea held 11,000 gallons of water. Like that's
wow.
a lot of water. That's a
I really
big
like
bowl.
Pancho. I really like how you read it in your study. It was a different translation, so it brought those numbers, those numbers and the categories of numbers. Like who knows what a bath is, or who knows what a like a cubit, but yeah. And so it put it in a kind of a modern context, and so I appreciate that. And
Yeah,
even
me
reading it,
too. It
I,
helps.
I
It
can't
helps.
I can't picture it beyond simple proportions. And one has 30, one has 60. Okay, I can visualize that, but I can't tell you what a cubit, how that meant to my daily. I think it's from the tip of your finger to your elbow. I think that's what a cubit is. But
All right.
if I remember correctly, but yeah, it's beyond that.
So
It's like, well,
30
I
of
can't.
those, 30 of those laid
Yeah,
out is
you tell
okay.
me a foot, I'm like, okay, 12 inches. Like I can kind of visualize the 12 inches. All right.
Hmm. It helps.
Back in the
That's
day,
why
they
it's
could.
southern nuclear. Yeah, it's again like so it's
Talk,
75 feet, 150 feet, 45 feet high. I'm like, okay, I can visualize that. I work with materials. I know what that means as opposed. And again, major love to ESV and I love LSB and all other formal translations, but it is nice to to have numbers you can picture in your head. You know.
well,
So we
landing
talked
the
about
plane,
this.
Poncho. Or unless you have more questions, I was going to say we can land the plane here if you want.
The last thing I have highlighted is, and that's probably pretty self-explanatory, but so he brought in at the very end, 51, he brought in all the gifts his father David had dedicated. So they had like a giant stash of things just kind of waiting for a home. Because obviously David wanted to build a temple he didn't get to. His hands were stained. His son gets to. So I'm assuming they just kind of had this hidden off somewhere, a stash
Yeah,
of David's things that he had dedicated to God that he wanted in the temple.
right. And we like that because he's continuing his father's legacy, and he's David was clearly God's guy, and Solomon was also chosen by God in a unique way, and to receive a blessing that no one else got. The blessing from God, and it definitely was God's chosen guy. And so he's of all the sons of David, God chose Solomon and not the other ones. And so to be the next in line, and there was the issue at the end of David's life about who's going to take over. We talked about that, and but yeah, this is I like how he continues that legacy. It seems like Solomon is on good footing right now. We know the end of Solomon's life is going to be it's going to go downhill, and but right now he seems to be doing what is right. Would you think so?
Yeah, it sounds like and we've talked about this before. I think when we were talking about getting the materials, and church, we talk about this a lot, like excellence, how God wants our best. And you could see
Mm.
clearly he spent a lot of time and dedicated a lot of material and things to the temple. So
I just wanted to point out something here. I drew a little picture. This is not to scale, of course, although I did add numbers. So this is and those of you listening, what I did was I just drew two boxes, two cubes rather. I now labeled one house of Yahweh and one house of Solomon. And the house of Yahweh is 30 by 20 by 60. So if you can imagine a cube like that, and the house of Solomon is 100 by 30 by 50. So it's almost twice the size. And the house that he built for God, he took 7 years to build. The house that he built for himself, he took 13 years to build. And this is just taking the text at face value, what the text gave us. They gave us those numbers, the height, the width, the breadth, okay, and the number of years. And with the number of years, it put those two verses side by side. He took 7 years to build the house for Yahweh, and now, for his own house, it took 13 years. And I'm just saying that's just something that I wonder, Pancho, just looking at these two graphics here and just imagining one cube being twice as big as the other, and the smaller one goes to God and the bigger one goes to you. Just taking those numbers graphically in your mind right now, if nothing else. Those of you watching can look right here, and we know Solomon's going to end kind of poorly. And if you believe Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes, you realize that he realized all the stuff that he lived for was just nonsense, vanity, chasing after the wind. I wonder, Pancho, if some of the fall starts when he builds his own house. And just looking at these two things here, some of his decline, you might say, we can't go further than that because the text does not criticize Solomon. God right here is not upset at Solomon. There's no verse saying, and God was displeased that Solomon built his house over twice the size. We don't have that. But I just wonder, it just stands out to me thinking about the numbers and thinking about how he spends twice as long on his own house they did for God. And then he builds the same size house for his pagan wife. I'm just
who
saying.
he was told not to marry, right? If I recall, he was told not to marry other.
I'm just saying. I wonder, Pancho, if he's going to have this slide, if some of the seeds planted from that slide and that slide downward is kind of a prideful thing. And I just wonder if we're seeing some of that in chapter 7. That's as far as I can go. I can't say anything further than that. But Pancho, just looking at these two graphics, what do you think? Besides, obviously, I'm not an artist.
It's a little arrogant. I think it looks. I think you again. You can't say for sure, and I don't know. It's my first time reading through this, but it does seem, if you look at the picture, it is like huge compared to the other one, and it's like, why? And he's a king, whatever. Sure, like you have palaces and stuff, but it's something we were talking about earlier in men's group. Like, do we need so much in life that you
Right.
need a giant house like that, and the Lord gets a small one? I don't know.
And I firmly believe this is not out of line because the text is clear. One verse later, end of chapter 6, beginning of chapter 7, but Solomon for his own house for 13 years. So right away, 7 verses 13, you're thinking to myself, my goodness, he was the one that was supposed to build the house of the Lord, and he's going to spend the extra time on his own house. How often do we build our own houses and how often do we are worried about our own followers and our own worth and our own
Building our own kingdoms. Yeah.
yeah. I just wonder about that. And I think it's a fair question, Pancho, because the text does give us that. It not only gives us the dimensions, but it does tell us one verse away for his own house, Solomon did this. And it's like, okay, the text didn't have to say that unless it really wanted to say that. And it's like God made that on purpose. Like, okay, so we're left to wonder here. As we're looking at a character study here with Solomon, we wonder if some of the seeds of his eventual selfish decline are going to start here when he's building his own house. And I think that's a good challenge for all of us who are listening to this or watching this. What do we do regarding our house and regarding God? I like how you said earlier, does God get my best or my rest? And Solomon definitely doesn't give God the rest. He gives God high quality stuff. He's really, I mean, what we read in chapter 6, that's a high quality gold inlaid cherubim. I mean, that's a serious temple. But he spent twice as long in his own house. I wonder if his own house is
So what? At least you didn't see gold in his house
all
anywhere in
right.
the text. You know, he still got the fine stone, and he took his time, but at least he gave all the gold to God. But
And
yeah,
he didn't have
it's
any he didn't
interesting.
have any cherubim either. So
That's right.
well, this has been great. We'll join you next week. This has been the Masterclass Theology. As always, I am Big Rev.
I'm Pancho.
Have a good week. God bless.